Hello, class, and welcome to Sir Searcher TV, where learning research is made easy. Today, we're going to discuss about quantitative research designs. Now, the goal of this lecture video is for us to really understand what we mean by quantitative research design. Oftentimes, during research proposal or during the planning phase of your research, you will be asked, what is your research design? And students will always get confused with that kind of question. But if we really do understand what is research design, it is very easy for us to identify what is it. And it's actually just a very simple concept to comprehend. Now, in here, we will be learning about different approaches in research, and you might find similar terms or similar concepts that you probably would have encountered already, okay, in the past. Okay, so let's get started. So let's begin first with defining what is research design, specifically quantitative research design. So, quantitative research design talks about the overall strategy utilized to carry out research that defines a logical plan to tackle established research questions through the collection, interpretation, analysis, and discussion of data. So, in short, when we speak about research design, it is a strategy. Okay. And a strategy is a series of actions geared towards a specific goal. And what is that? That is to answer your research question. Okay. And in order for us to do that, it is important that we need to define how we're going to collect the data, how we are going to interpret the data, and eventually analyze and discuss so that we can derive through a conclusion or the answer to our research question. Okay, so very simple class. If we speak about research design, it's your strategy. How will you answer your question based on the planned strategy that you're going to implement? So this will determine the bulk or the direction of your methodology, your data collection, and your data analysis. Okay, so there are two major types of quantitative research design. So let us not forget or let us take note of these. The first one is your experimental research design, and the second is your non-experimental research design. Okay, so let us just have a very quick comparison between these two research designs. Now, if we speak about experimental research design, we are most likely talking about, okay, experimentation. And what is this experimentation? We will discuss later on. So it's more controlled. Okay. So the type of strategy that we have here is more controlled. The researcher can really do a lot of manipulation. Yes, that is also another important term that we can uh, associate with experimental research design. So there's manipulation, experimentation, and it is highly controlled. While non-experimental, on the other hand, is more naturalistic. Okay. And there is no manipulation, although there is some degree of control, but unlike in your experiment, there is really no introduction of a treatment variable, or extraneous variables are not really very controlled. So in terms of the level of control, non-experimental research design are more lax. Okay, they are more less stringent, less complex. Okay, while experimental research design really follows a very strict and a very complex process. Okay, So that's just a quick um, differentiation or comparison between your experimental and your non-experimental research design. Okay, so now let's move on to our first research design. And this is now our experimental research design. Now, we already know that experimental research design entails a lot of control. There is experimentation, there is manipulation. But what do we really mean when we say experimental research design? Okay, now experimental research design is a quantitative research design. Remember this, that base its research method on a scientific activity called an experiment. Yes, there. Okay. And what is an experiment? It is a test or examination. Okay, so tandaan din na that this is a test or an exam of a thing under a manipulated or controlled environment. An exam in a controlled. Okay, so this is what we were talking about a while ago. Okay, it is an exam in a controlled environment, and it is done to determine the validity of truthfulness of such a thing. So, experiment is an exam in a controlled environment so that we can establish a strong validity. Okay. So remember that validity is always associated with control. If the researcher does not really put a lot of control into his or her methodology, sometimes validity can be questioned. But if you have a very established and strong control, and if you do it in an experimental design, then rest assured that there is a strong validity. Okay, so there's experiment. Now, another characteristic of your experimental research design is the presence of your groups. And what is this? Now, the very basic and minimum requirement for an experimental research, for a research to be um, tagged or to be identified as experiment is the presence of your groups. And usually, you have here two groups. Okay. So, and what are these two groups? Okay, let me just highlight on this. So, the two groups here is we have your control group and your treatment group. Okay. Now, your control group does not receive your treatment. Okay. While your treatment, of course, is the one who receives the treatment. Okay, wait. All right. So it's the one who receives. Okay. So sorry, I got a wrong spelling here. So it's okay. So it's the one who receives the treatment. Okay. However, the treatment group here may not be limited only to one group. Okay. It could be several treatment groups depending on the objective of the researcher. All right. And then let's also take note that an experimental research design also includes tests. Okay, and so this is what we were talking a while ago. So there is an introduction of your treatment variable, and your treatment variable is always your intervention. Okay. Now, your intervention here, do not be confused, class, because there are some students who get confused with the intervention with correlation. So remember that the intervention should be something different, something new, or something that does not exist in the natural setting where the variables are located. So you introduce a novel variable and see how the other variables interact with that novel or new variable that you have introduced. Okay. Aside from that, in some experimental research approaches, okay, you do two types of tests. Okay. So, and what are these? We have your pre-test and your post-test. Okay. So take note that the pre, from its prefix pre, it means before. So prior to the introduction of your intervention here, you have already conducted the test. And after that, you introduce the treatment and see whether there might be changes that will occur or there might be some uh, interaction that might happen. And after which you test again. So that's your post test already to see and to validate whether changes happened or there is some sort of interaction during the introduction of your intervention. Okay, so again, your experimental research design has the concept of experiment, concept of groups, and concept of tests. Okay, now for your experimental research design class, let's also take a look at the okay, two types. Okay, so the two types of your experimental research is we have your true experimental research design and quasi experimental research design. Now, let's cut the deal short and let's establish the major difference between the two. Okay, all right. Now, the main difference between the two types of experimental research design class is the manner or the way that your participants or your subjects are selected. Amo lang kina. That's the very basic difference between the two. Now, your true experimental follows a random selection. And when we say random selection, equal chances of selection here. Okay, so there is probability selection. So we will talk more about that when we discuss sampling. While quasi-experimental has a non-random subject selection or purposive selection. Now remember that when we say quasi, it means partially, pseudo, or almost. Okay, so partial, or pseudo. So meaning it gets some qualities of your true experimental research design, but not totally everything. Okay, so there is still manipulation, there is still control, but then the manner that you select your respondents in your quasi-experimental is purposive or prone to bias as compared to your true experimental. Okay. Now, when I say true or prone to bias, this is caused by, again, your purposive and rather than random selection of your participants. That is why sometimes some authors would define or would state that your quasi experimental is actually incapable of establishing a strong and a valid cause and effect relationship because of the sampling selection method. And true enough, that could be the case. However, let's remember that there are some limitations in our uh, research process or in our research plan that the researcher might probably uh, resolve or would decide to do a quasi experimental rather than a true experimental. And one of those reasons is the unavailability or the limited number or the limited amount of, okay, okay, it's the limited amount or the limitations of your participants or of your respondents or subjects. So let's say you have a specific target subject and there are only like very few of them available. So you cannot do randomization anymore because of such limitations. Okay, yes. Now let's proceed to the types of quasi-experimental research design. All right. So your true experimental is just only one. So if you do there are actually other types of true experimental, but let's not really include this in this video lecture yet. We could have a separate one on that. But let me just talk about the different types of quasi-experimental research design types. Okay, so the first one is your matched comparison group. Okay, so in your match comparison group, instead of selecting participants for the control group, you get a set of participants that shows close similarities with the experimental or treatment group based on one or more important variables. So there. So you already have your experimental or treatment group, but then here you get to uh set or choose participants that have similarities, okay? That have similarities with your experimental or treatment group, okay? So that's how you're gonna do it. So you already have your experimental group, and then you just find similar participants to your experimental group. That's matched comparison group design. Okay, the second one is your time series quasi experimental design. Your act of controlling in this type of design of variables, in this case, is through multiple observation of the subjects. So there is multiple observation, okay, of the subjects. And this multiple observation of the subjects are done usually before and after the treatment condition applied to the experimental group. The purpose of serial observation here is to see the connection between the pretest and the post-test based on the taking place of the treatment or condition. So in short, we are conducting here a longitudinal approach. And when I say longitudinal approach, all right, uh, a certain period of time or the data gathering and observation happens not just only in one specific period, but is observed in several periods or time. Okay, next we have, oh, yes, your counterbalanced quasi-experimental design. So in here, control is applied to one group to examine the effects of all treatment and condition to control variables. So control here is applied to one group only. Okay. All right. So applied to one group only. And remember, okay, so let me give an example. For example, negative results coming from the three-time observation are counterbalanced or given weight that is equated with positive results from four or five-time observation. So that's a counterbalanced quasi-experimental design. And finally, we have your single subject quasi experimental. The design is used when the population is so large that you find difficulty in choosing a group of studies. So, what you do, you decide to apply the condition or treatment to a single subject like a class of learners. So, from the name itself, single subject, so it's one cluster of subjects. And in here, okay, so that, and then later find out the effects of the treatment on the entire class. All right, so that's what you do under your single subject quasi experimental design. So I would probably assume that in your single subject you do not have let's say another control group in this case, because you only apply it to a single cluster or one cluster of subjects. Okay, now, let's proceed to our experimental research design stages. Now, this is important, class, that when we decide or when we come up with the type of research design, we have to follow the process. So, number one is that you need to have a clear knowledge of the research objectives that enables you to decide not only on the kind of research that you have to do, but also on the manner that you have to follow in your conducting your research. Again, always remember that your design should be aligned and appropriate to your research objectives. Then you need to follow or you need to formulate your hypothesis. Now, sir, is it really required that you need to have hypothesis if we do experimental research design? Yes, and yes. So this is a required step. Why? Because the following step is for hypothesis testing. So in here, we have to decide what kind statistical tool, okay, that we are going to use in order for us to test wh- uh, or whether to accept or reject our hypothesis. So, in here, you have to decide what method of testing you do in your hypothesis, and you examine their validity, like deciding whether you have to follow the experimental design or the quasi experimental design. Okay. Next, you need to do, or you need to decide on your instrument. So in here, you have to determine whether you're going to conduct an interview, observation, or questionnaire, or on a certain method that you think you might use in analyzing your data later on. After you have your instrument of choice, it's now time for you to come up with your subject selection. So in here, your sampling is also okay. So sampling method is done. Now, um, I will discuss sampling in another video, but remember, class, that when you do experiments, sampling is very, very critical and very crucial because this will also determine the generalizability of your results. So basically, the more samples you have in an experimental research design, the better. Okay, so that's just the basic principle that you have to think. If we conduct an experiment, the more samples we have, the more likely that our results will be turned valid. Okay, and this is something to do with your statistical analysis later on. And you would appreciate that if we reach already our topic on sampling method. And then you start now doing your experimentation that allows you to control the cropping up of extraneous variables and experimenters' biases. And I forgot, oh, by the way, I forgot. In your experimentation, we mentioned a while ago about pretest, right? Okay. Now, another purpose of your pretest class is for you to identify, okay, your extraneous variables. And remember what we talked about extraneous variables? Okay, so these are variables that are extra variables that might just exist within the research model. They might not really create a lot of changes or interaction to your IVDV or independent and dependent variable, but they have the tendency or the threat to become confounding variable later on. So your pretest also allows the researchers to identify these extraneous variables and do some control measures, okay, on your extraneous variables. And we will talk about control measures of extraneous variables in another video on internal validity. Okay. And finally, okay, we are now ready to data analyze or data analysis. And in here, we will now apply our statistical tool or our statistical treatment or our statistical analysis. Okay, so all of these steps should be cohesive, should be aligned, should be towards a certain goal, and that is now referred back to your research objectives. Okay, next, non-experimental research design. All right, so just let's talk a little bit about this. Now, we mentioned a while ago with our quick comparison with our experimental and non-experimental. We said that non-experimental is actually more naturalistic. So yes, that's correct. So it's naturalistic, and then we have here less control. Okay, it doesn't mean no control at all. Okay, no control is different from less control. So in less control, you still have control, but it's not as complex or as rigid as compared to our experimental research design. Okay, and of course, in your non-experimental research design, this may also yield both. No, not may, but this will yield both quantitative and qualitative data. Unlike in your experimental, it's always quantitative. You cannot experiment on qualitative data unless you're going to uh, convert or assign a quantitative um, representation of your qualitative data, but exclusively experimental design or experimental research designs only deal with quantitative data. But in your non-experimental, you can deal both quantitative and qualitative data. Okay. So now let's take a look here. So we are about to finish our lecture. So this is just a very quick review of the types, all right, of your non-experimental research. And the most basic here is your descriptive, which depicts an image or a picture of an individual or group. So this one uh, depicts image, okay, of an individual or group. Okay, so this is very easy. You just have to describe. Okay, so technically, what you do here is you describe the phenomenon. All right. So that's what you do under descriptive. And comparative, all right, what you do here is differences and similarities, okay, from the name itself. Differences and similarities between people, objects, or things, or within the phenomena. And correlational, oh, by the way, I forgot. In your descriptive, we can also do surveys here. So survey is actually more of an approach rather than a design. Okay, so survey is like a data collection approach where you get to ask a certain group of people and then quantify as to the frequency of their responses. Okay, correlational, on the other hand, all right, talks about the extent and direction of variable relationship. Okay, so here we establish a cause and effect relationship without the presence of an intervention. Okay, so abugi na siya ang very distinct class na difference nila ha. Your correlational, you establish relationship, so probably your cause and effect. Okay, but in here, take note, no intervention. Once there is an intervention, it becomes now your experimental. But if plainly you wanted to establish the cause and effect of relationship of two variables as they naturally exist, or if you're going to create the behavior of one variable in accordance with the behavior of the other, so you're establishing a survey. All right. And of course, the last here is your ex post facto, which means after the fact, or that which is done afterwards. So ex post facto literally means after the fact. Okay, so it's like a somehow a retrospective study, but not totally retrospective, because you are trying to establish or measure the causes or the different factors in the past that have contributed to the current phenomenon. And the purpose of deriving data from things that are by nature taking place was obtain explanation about past events. That's according to Lickman in 2013. Okay, so we are about to end our lesson. Just a few nuggets of the things that we have discussed. Research design is a strategy. So that means it consists of different activities towards answering your research question until your data analysis at the end. Then we have two types, experimental and non-experimental. Experimental is highly controlled with the presence of your intervention. Non-experimental is more on the naturalistic and less control. Your experimental can be true experimental, which randomly selects your subjects, and it could be quasi if it is non-randomly selected. And with that, thank you very much, class, and we will see each other again to our next lesson. So this is your Sir Searcher Teacher Ian, and class dismissed.